Status check. Go Atlas. Go Centaur. Go Starliner. Godspeed, Butch and Sonny.
Almost 3 months ago, 2 NASA astronauts boarded a commercial spacecraft known as the Starliner. It was built by Boeing, and this was its first crewed test flight.
Now let's put some fire in this rocket, and let's push it to the heavens where all these tough Americans have prepared it to be.
Let's go, Calypso. Take us to space and back.
The voices you just heard, those are the 2 astronauts, Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams.
3, 2, 1, ignition. And liftoff of Starliner and Atlas V, carrying 2 American heroes, drawing a line to the stars for all of us.
The launch went smoothly, but as the Starliner approached the International Space Station, thrusters failed at a critical moment. The astronauts were able to dock, and they boarded the space station fine. But soon after, people learned that these astronauts were going to be in space much longer than anticipated. Until this weekend, we didn't even have an estimate about when they would be returning. And whenever I've thought about this story, I've been struggling to understand their exact situation. So Chris, are they stuck? Are they stranded? Are they just delayed for a really, really long time?
I think at this point, it's fair to say they are stuck.
That is Chris Davenport. He covers the space industry for The Post.
NASA would argue vigorously that they're not stranded because they could come home tomorrow or today in an emergency, but they've had their tour extended a long, long time.
A mission that was originally supposed to be 8 days will now last 8 months. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Tuesday, August 27th. The Boeing Starliner was supposed to open up another frontier for NASA. It was going to be a whole new way for NASA to get crew members up to the International Space Station. And then the Starliner ran into some serious trouble. So today, we are talking about the risks to the 2 NASA astronauts stuck in space and what the Starliner's fate could say about the future of commercial spaceflight in the U.S. So, Chris, you've been reporting a lot over the last few years about the role that private companies like Boeing and SpaceX are playing in the future of spaceflight here in the U.S. So what has been the importance of these companies and their relationship with NASA over the last few years?
There's been a real paradigm shift within NASA and the way NASA explores. And before, NASA owned and operated all of the hardware. I mean, it always had contractors, but ultimately it was NASA's mission, right? They operated the space shuttle. They operated the Saturn V rocket that flew astronauts to the moon. Now it's different, right? They have outsourced a lot of their missions to the private sector, where, for example, SpaceX is operating the capsule and the rocket that are flying NASA's astronauts, not NASA.
Because the thought is that these private companies can do it better and faster and more efficiently for less money.
Right, all of that. And the idea is that frees NASA up to do other things, to explore further, to do some of the harder missions. But what's interesting is we're seeing that paradigm, which NASA used to initially just fly cargo and supplies to the International Space Station. And that was sort of the entry point. And they weren't ever going to put NASA astronauts, they weren't going to put people, human beings, on a privately run spaceship. But then that changed. And they saw, wait, if they can deliver cargo and supplies, maybe they can fly people. And now SpaceX has been doing that since 2020. And NASA's looking at that and saying, well, that's working.
So let's talk about this particular mission, which is, as you say, part of that push to basically get private companies to do the work of transporting astronauts to the space station and potentially to other places. But this mission, I don't know if the right word is stars, but at the center of it are these 2 astronauts, Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore. Can you talk a little bit about them?
They are veteran NASA astronauts who have been to space each twice before. They're not rookies by any sense. I mean, these are kind of the best of the best. They're both former Navy retired captains. Butch was a fighter test pilot, and Sonny flew helicopters. And they've been training for this flight for a long time, which you remember is a test flight. The whole idea of this flight was the first time they were going to put human beings on the Starliner capsule. And they wanted, serious, experienced astronauts to be able to do that.
The one thing I remembered about Sunny when this started to come up was, I guess it was a few years back, that she had actually ran a marathon in space, correct?
Right, on a treadmill.
We are somewhere over the Pacific Ocean about to cross the equator. She's running on our treadmill vibration isolation system, or TVIS. And there are two...
Because in space you have to exercise. You need to keep your bone density up and your muscles strong, because in that weightless environment, you kind of lose a lot of that. So yeah, no, she's great. She's has a lot of energy, is a lot of fun. I've met her several times and interviewed her. So how did you become an astronaut?
So Top Gun had come out, and I thought, wow, I want to be Tom Cruise and fly jets and be cool. I didn't get jets, I got helicopters, and then I became a helicopter pilot. And helicopters have usually break down, periodically break down, and so I sort of started wondering how they actually worked.
She's also, and NASA thinks about this too, not just how they are going to react when a thruster problem happens or if a mission has to be extended, but they're also ambassadors for the space agency, and NASA looks to the sort of PR aspects to it. And they're both, very well spoken and charming and dynamic and just sort of really interesting people.
So tell me, what exactly was this original mission supposed to be? You said it was a test flight. So, what does that entail? And what were some of the factors here that were the new factors for how this was all going to work?
So Starliner had done a series of test flights earlier without anyone on board. And the first one ran into problems in 2019. So they actually had to redo it without astronauts on the capsule. This was a test to see how the capsule performed with astronauts on board. So they need to test out the life support systems. And so it was supposed to be just a quick test to the International Space Station, last just about 8 days, and that would be enough for them to get that data on how it flew to the station, how it came home with people on board.
So that was the plan. And then the launch actually happened on June 5th of this year. How did that launch go? And how did the reality play out differently from expectations?
Yeah. Initially, everything went well. The launch went well. It went into the right orbit. It was maneuvering toward the space station. And then as it was getting closer to the space station, they started having these problems with the thrusters. The spacecraft has got a total of 28 of these smaller thrusters. They're called RCS thrusters, or reaction control thrusters. And they're just little puffs to orient the vehicle.
Yeah, when you're saying thrusters, I'm imagining just little things on the side that are going pew, pew, to kind of move them left and right and up and down. And that's, I guess, how you move around.
Absolutely. And they fire almost constantly. Mm-hmm. The working theory is that they were firing too much and getting too hot, and that was creating a problem. And they started shutting off. At least 5 of them did. At a moment when you not only have these 2 astronauts floating in orbit in the void of space, but they're approaching the International Space Station, where there are a whole host of astronauts living. Mm-hmm. And the last thing that NASA wants, or our partners, our international partners, including Russia, the last thing they want is a collision or anything bad to happen. So they
see. So that the thrust, if the thrusters aren't working right, not only do you have a chance of, I guess, missing the space station, you could also accidentally crash into it.
Theoretically. Yeah, and that's what they're really worried about. So docking with the International Space Station is this very carefully choreographed event where there are certain, they call them waypoints, where the spacecraft goes and then waits. And then they make sure everything's okay. And then they proceed to the next spot a little bit closer, and they inch their way in. And if you think about it, the International Space Station is traveling in orbit at 17,500 miles an hour. Right? It's 5 miles a second.
Oh my God.
And it's really tricky, and you've got to park it.
So as it became clear that not all the thrusters were working, what did that feel like to the astronauts, or how were they able to successfully dock anyways?
Well, it was tense, and they had to sort of stop, and they powered down the thrusters, and 4 of the 5 failed thrusters eventually came back online, and they were able to dock successfully. But it shows the, experience and the capability that the astronauts have. But to be clear, that was a hair-raising moment.
Have either of these astronauts talked about that moment since then?
Station, this is Houston. Are you ready for the event?
Yeah, we got a brief conversation with them. They did a chat from the International Space Station.
I'm not sure we could have gotten a better welcome. I mean, we had music, we had Matt was dancing. It was great.
We're just happy as can be to be up in space, one in Starliner, on an Atlas V, and then here on the International Space Station. It just doesn't get much better.
You know, as I was saying before, they're chosen because they're, they want to put a good face on everything. And they, talked about how resilient Starliner was and how well it did operate. Even though it had this problem, it was able to get them safely to the ISS. And they were, I think, grateful, but also, in their minds, it seemed to show that this is a robust vehicle. And this was, shortly after the docking. So maybe in mid-June, they were talking about that. And at the time, I think they fully expected to come home in Starliner.
So the question since that launch and that docking is, like, what exactly went wrong? And could that same problem go wrong again? Now it's been almost 3 months since they've been on the International Space Station. What has been going on behind the scenes in trying to figure out, like, what happened with this problem with the thrusters? Could it happen again? And how are Sunny and Butch going to get home?
So ever since the crew docked with the station and they realized they had these problems with the thrusters, you had NASA and Boeing, essentially launch an investigation and trying to figure out what went wrong and find the root cause of the problem and to determine, is this going to be an issue for the return flight? Because they're going to have to use those same thrusters to get home. They begin poring over all kinds of data, including running a series of tests where they could actually take hardware built for other spacecraft and test the thrusters out on the ground at the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico and try to replicate the entire flight profile on the way to the station and the flight profile on the way home and see what the problems were and what sort of issues they might run into. I think the problem was they weren't fully able to replicate the conditions in space. I don't think they were confident that they had the exact conditions. And they kept doing more testing. And NASA kept saying, we're not satisfied. Do more testing.
Because this is Boeing that's doing the testing, and NASA is just either overseeing this or, like, what is the relationship between Boeing and NASA here?
Correct. And you have NASA teams embedded, with side by side with those Boeing engineers. Boeing is doing the testing and then saying, here's the data, here's, the information, and they're all reviewing it together. And NASA started really looking very carefully at that. They said, we're not going to rush this. What's at stake is the lives of 2 astronauts. We said initially that it was supposed to be 8 days, but we knew going into this all along it was a test flight. It could go longer. And we're not going to be faced with any sort of pressure to make a decision that could affect their lives prematurely, which is what you saw during Challenger and Columbia. You may recall Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in 1986, a couple minutes after it lifted off, and there was that huge orange fireball set against that deep blue sky. And then you had another tragedy many years later in 2003 when Space Shuttle Columbia came apart as it was returning to Earth. And those really, were tragedies that left deep, deep scars among NASA's leadership. Here they're saying, we're not going to rush a decision. We're going to hear all views.
What has Boeing been saying during this process, and not including what they've now said since Saturday?
Right. They were saying all along, we feel like it's safe. We feel like we understand the problem. They can come home. And there were people at NASA who just flat out disagreed and said, we don't have enough confidence. Now, the luxury that NASA has that they, didn't always have in the space shuttle era was they have a backup. There's no reason to bring them home on Starliner if you don't feel it's safe. There's another provider. And that was the goal going in to what's called the Commercial Crew Program, this idea that you outsource human spaceflight, transportation to the International Space Station, to the private sector. Initially, a lot of people within NASA on Capitol Hill said, you don't need 2 providers. You've got Boeing. They're the giant aerospace company. There's this other company,
SpaceX. The best of the best. You can just put your money on that one company.
And there was a meeting when they were looking through the contracts, and a lot of NASA people, they did a roll call. And everybody in the room, they were voting for Boeing. And there were just a few people saying, we need two providers. Mm-hmm. If someone goes down, if there's, we lived through Challenger and Columbia. After those disasters, NASA was unable to fly for about a year. They were grounded for a year while they did these investigations.
So that's the case for having redundancies in place, is that, okay, if one isn't working, then we can always use the other one.
Right.
Well, let me ask this. In the time that NASA has been trying to make this decision and Boeing has been doing all this testing, and what has that been like for Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore? What have they been up to up there in the space station, just waiting for all these people to hash it out?
Right. So the space station is an orbiting laboratory. So they've been doing science experiments. They've been put to work. There are 2 more hands on the station, and they've been there before. And so they know sort of the routine. And so they do science experiments, and they have to do maintenance. There was a problem with one of the toilets on the space station, so they work to fix that. NASA's now going to find a way to integrate them into the crew as if this was the way it was planned all along, that we're just going to tack on a normal crew rotation mission. They'll be assigned more science to do, more maintenance. They may even get to go do a spacewalk and do repairs on the outside of the station. So they're up there, they're going to work.
After the break, I talk with Chris about the new plan for getting Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams home, and what that decision says about NASA's willingness to take risks. We'll be right back. So let's talk about the decision that was made on Saturday to keep these astronauts up there for quite a while, right? They're going from 8 days to 8 months in space. Tell me about the press conference where this decision was announced.
NASA Administrator Bill Nelson just came out and said it.
NASA has decided that Butch and Sonny will return with Crew 9 next February, and that Starliner will return uncrewed.
I think NASA, they were disappointed. They were more than disappointed. They were sad.
Our core value is safety, and it is our North Star. And I'm grateful to NASA and to Boeing for their teams, for all the incredible and detailed work to get to this decision.
They've been working for years to get Starliner up and running, and they've overcome all kinds of problems. And this was going to be the moment where they finally got it online. And they had, for the first time ever, a second way to transport astronauts to the International Space Station on an American vehicle. And that here they were saying it didn't work.
Spaceflight is risky, even at its safest. And even at its most routine. And a test flight by nature is neither safe nor routine.
What are the costs of this decision, or what are the drawbacks why this was not something that NASA necessarily wanted to have as the first option beyond just like the embarrassment of it all?
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of it was a test flight and to see how the spacecraft performed. There are some questions as to whether, if you don't fly Starliner home with the astronauts, if NASA then has all the data and information it needs as a part of this test flight to go ahead and certify Boeing and Starliner to say, yeah, you may now proceed to do regular crewed rotation flights flying 4 astronauts for 6 months. So it's unclear if they're going to be able to certify Starliner or if they're going to have to do another test flight. And they don't know the answer to that yet. And, they need to see how the return trip goes. They're going to fly Starliner back without any crew on board. If it goes perfectly, I think it'll be a little bit of an I told you so moment for Boeing. And NASA will have to look and say, do we have enough data to be able to certify Starliner for the regular crewed flights? Now, on the other hand, I mean, that's sort of what's at stake, but it's much more preferable to have the disappointment and the sadness and the embarrassment than to have something tragically go wrong.
Yeah.
And that's what's in their minds.
Of course. What has been the reaction from Boeing since this announcement was made? And just how big of a blow is this decision for Boeing's space program?
Publicly, they say they're going to continue on. They're going to be professional. They're going to bring Starliner home. They're going to do the testing and make all the modifications to satisfy NASA's requirements and continue to move forward. Privately, they're fuming, a lot of them within the company. And my reporting sort of shows that they had said from the beginning they thought that Starliner was safe. This is a huge embarrassment for them. The program has been a very difficult one. Because of the nature of the contract, it's a firm fixed price contract. NASA gave them $4.2 billion to develop Starliner. But as a result of all the problems and delays, Boeing has had to spend about $1.6 billion of its own money to fix all of this. So it's been a little hard as well, let alone reputationally. And let's not forget, of course, all of the problems that the company has had with its commercial aviation division and all their defense programs.
Is not doing particularly well at the same time, right? Like that's the undertone in all of this, which is that Boeing, when it comes to commercial aviation, the flights you and I take every day, like there have been a lot of hits to that part of its reputation recently because of some of those high-profile incidents we've seen are similarly embarrassing.
Right. And now you've got a problem with their space program. And the space program has a sort of outsized spot in the national consciousness, right? Like human spaceflight is such a prestigious thing. It's so difficult. It's so risky that if Boeing were to walk away from it, and it almost says that we're out of the space business altogether, and Boeing has been in the space business since the dawn of the space age.
The thing that makes this story really interesting to me is that it feels like this is a story about what we as a country are willing to risk to keep doing space, what we're willing to risk, what we're not willing to risk, how we think about those risks. I don't know. I'm curious, like, what you think about that. What do you think this situation tells us about what our country is willing to put at stake to be able to do space travel in the future and do it in different ways than we've seen before?
Right. So it's such a great question, right? All they're doing is it's sort of having a deep meditation on risk. And what are the risks and what are we willing to risk? And in fact, that question is even written into the contract that NASA has with Boeing and SpaceX.
Written how?
There is a metric that NASA has come up with to measure what is the likelihood of a loss of crew. What is the likelihood that you're going to kill them, that they're going to die? And NASA, the requirement is that risk can be no greater than 1 in 270.
Wow.
Right. And so,
and I mean, it's interesting that it's not zero, but I guess that's what space travel is all about. There's always a risk, but that they're trying to keep that risk quite low.
So that's the risk that they're willing to put up with. There's a story at the beginning of the space shuttle program on its very first flight in 1981. The shuttle wasn't able to fly autonomously. For SpaceX and for Boeing, they both did these test flights without any crew on board because the capsules are autonomous. Shuttle needed a pilot to fly it. And NASA engineer, I heard him once say that they estimated the loss of crew metric for that flight to be between 1 in 500 and 1 in 5,000. But they didn't really know because they hadn't flown shuttle before. And then they started flying shuttle, and they saw how it performed and how it behaves, and they had the data. And after 4 or 5 or 6 flights, they went back and they calculated the loss of crew metric for that first flight. It was 1 in 12.
Oh, wow. So it sounds like what you're saying is that back in, I don't know, maybe what people think of the glory days of when we were first sending people out to space and sending people to the moon, that we actually had a very high tolerance for risk, which is, demonstrated by people who did die as part of some of those missions, but that we were willing to take those risks because this was new and exciting and something that we really cared about.
And you have to wonder about that. And it's an interesting thing about risk. I mean, they say in spaceflight, it's better to be on the ground wishing you were in space than to be in space wishing you were on the ground.
That makes sense to me.
Right. But it's funny because human spaceflight has this, the consequences are enormous and the outfall is enormous and everything sort of stops right, with these tragedies, and they're national tragedies. But you think about like the commercial aspect of it. Now there are these space tourists who are flying and going to space, and at some time something's going to happen to one of them. And does that have the same level of outfall and consequence? I mean, there are people who go climb Mount Everest and die all the time. You're literally stepping over bodies. So it's this interesting, I know, sort of dynamic that space plays. It's a little bit different.
And as we do this more, as people go to the space station and also go to the moon, and that we have rich people who are doing it for fun, in addition to scientists and engineers who are doing it to like further mankind, that like that question of risk gets more complicated and like how much we care about it.
And people, I mean, if we're going to the moon and Mars, people are going to die. When you're crossing the Atlantic or the Pacific for the first time, it's just so hard. It's so risky.
Chris, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Christian Davenport covers NASA and the space industry for The Post. And before we go, some news from the campaign trail. Former President Donald Trump announced Tuesday that he has added Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to his transition team. This comes just a few days after Kennedy suspended his presidential campaign and decided to endorse Trump. In a recent interview with Tucker Carlson, Kennedy said that he's coming onto the transition team to, quote, help pick the people who will be running the government. Trump is also going to bring on former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who also endorsed him for president. If you want to understand more about what this moment means, take a listen to today's episode of The Campaign Moment. Senior political reporter Aaron Blake weighs in on how RFK's endorsement is shaking up the race and whether it will help or hurt Vice President Kamala Harris.
Kennedy's exit from the race, in addition to getting rid of a candidate who was pulling more votes from Trump, leaves three pretty left-leaning independent and third-party candidates remaining in the race. And so we are seeing the Harris campaign be concerned about this. We are seeing fights over ballot access for these candidates that are really raging pretty hard right now.
To hear that episode, find The Campaign Moment wherever you listen to podcasts. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's show was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon with help from Sabby Robinson. It was edited by Rena Flores. Thanks also to Chris Rowland. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.